Nobody in that conference room had slept in 3 days, and it showed. 18 attorneys, 18 of the most decorated defense lawyers in the country, sat around a glass table covered in stacked binders, cold coffee cups, and the particular silence of people who have stopped believing they can win. The lead counsel, a man whose name appeared on the doors of 4 different law firms, pushed his glasses up and said the words everyone in that room had been circling for 72 hours. "We need to advise her to take the deal." No one argued. That was the worst part. No one argued. And somewhere down the hall, behind a door with her name still on it, Audrey Langston, the woman who had built one of the largest pharmaceutical research companies in the country from a rented lab bench and a personal loan, sat alone, listening to the silence where her future used to be. Then the door at the far end of the corridor opened. A man in a gray uniform walked through it, pushing a cleaning cart, a clipboard resting on top. He paused at the window that looked into the conference room and stood there for a long moment, looking not at the attorneys but at the documents spread across the table. Then he stepped inside and said something that made every head in that room turn. Something the lawyers would remember for the rest of their careers. Audrey Langston was 46 years old. She had spent the first 20 of those years building something, the second decade refining it, and the last 3 watching it be systematically dismantled by a federal prosecution that moved with the quiet certainty of a machine that had already decided where it was going. Langston Biosciences occupied the top 4 floors of a building in downtown Philadelphia and employed just over 2,000 people. Its pediatric antibiotic research program had produced 2 drugs that were now standard treatment protocols in hospitals across 38 states. Audrey had not built any of it elegantly or without conflict. She had built it through an almost unreasonable commitment to being right. Right about the science, right about the ethics, right about the details other executives delegated and forgot. She reviewed every major trial submission personally. She knew the name of every lab director in her 3 research facilities. She had once delayed a product launch by 4 months because a single data point in a Phase 3 trial looked slightly inconsistent with the Phase 2 baseline, and she had refused to move until she understood exactly why. She was not the kind of person who falsified safety data. People who knew her knew this with the bone-deep certainty of long familiarity. The problem was that the documents said otherwise. The documents, 37 internal lab reports covering the clinical development of Velenex, a respiratory drug now on the market, bore what appeared to be her authorization signature. They had been submitted to the FDA as part of the drug's approval package, and according to 3 separate forensic document analysts retained by the prosecution, they had been altered after the fact. Statistical outliers quietly removed. Adverse event patterns smoothed into something regulatory reviewers wouldn't question. The alterations were subtle and technically sophisticated, and, according to the prosecution's theory, authorized from the top. Audrey said she had never seen those specific reports. The versions she remembered reviewing and signing were different, she insisted. But the originals she described could not be found. Her personal hard drive had failed 18 months earlier, and the backup server logs showed a gap. There was no version history, no audit trail running in her favor. There were only the 37 documents with her signature and the testimony of a former Langston lab director named Glenn Harwick, who had accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation and now said, under oath, that Audrey had personally instructed him to clean up the numbers. The trial had been running for 11 weeks. By every legal analyst covering it, it was not going well. The Kessler Building, which housed the offices of Moretti, Bain & Associates, the firm leading Audrey's defense, was a 1960s structure renovated twice since the millennium and still not quite sure what it wanted to be. Original terrazzo floor in the lobby, glass and reclaimed oak on the upper floors it had gutted and rebuilt. Its security was handled by a contract firm that hired people who knew how to be present without causing trouble. Marcus Webb had worked the overnight shift at Kessler for 14 months. He was 47, broad across the shoulders, in the way of men who'd spent years in physical work, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a stillness in his face that people found either reassuring or unsettling, depending on their own relationship with silence. His colleagues knew him as quiet, reliable, and unwilling to cut corners on his rounds. His supervisors found him easy to schedule, since he never called in sick and never asked for favors. None of them knew much else about him, and Marcus did not offer. What they didn't know was that Marcus Webb had spent 15 years as a licensed structural engineer and building code inspector for Allegheny County. He had reviewed the construction documents for more than 400 buildings and flagged deficiencies other inspectors missed. Not because he was smarter than them, but because he'd learned, over 15 years of reading paper that was supposed to represent physical reality, to notice when the two didn't align. He had an almost involuntary habit of reading timestamps, permit dates, and certification sequences the way other people read faces. He could tell when something had been signed out of order. He could tell when a document described a space that shouldn't have existed yet. He had left that career 4 years earlier when his wife Elena died of pancreatic cancer over 8 months that felt both impossibly fast and impossibly long. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, and by that September, Marcus understood that his daughter, Rosie, 7 years old, with her mother's laugh and the exact shape of her mother's hands, needed a father who came home at a predictable time, who was there when she woke up and there when she went to sleep, not the kind of parent who got called to a job site at midnight because a foundation report had gone out with the wrong load calculations and the pour was scheduled for 6 in the morning. He took the security job because the hours were fixed, the benefits included dental, and Rosie's school was 4 blocks from the Kessler building, close enough that he could be there when the bell rang if someone covered his overlap. He told himself it was temporary. He was still telling himself that. The Moretti team had been working out of Kessler's 5th-floor conference suite for 6 weeks, with an extended access agreement, 2 new locked filing cabinets, and a dedicated shredder. Marcus knew their schedule better than they probably realized. The junior associates left around 11. The partners sometimes stayed past 2. And the woman at the center of it all, who came in for strategy sessions, always sat facing the door, always arrived with a single leather portfolio and nothing else, and always thanked whoever held the elevator for her, without exception. He had noticed her the way he noticed most things, not intrusively, completely. On the night of March 19th, Marcus was making his second pass of the 5th floor at midnight when he heard voices through the partially open conference room door, not arguing, exactly, more like exhaustion arguing with itself. He stopped his cart and listened, not out of nosiness, but the same instinct that made him finish every round, whether the floor looked clean or not. He heard plea agreement and negotiated outcome, and the best we can do given the evidentiary landscape. He heard a woman's voice say, "I did not do this," flat and precise, the voice of someone who has said the same thing many times and watched it fail to land every time. He heard a man's voice mention the timeline of the document alterations and the absence of a viable alternative narrative. It wasn't his business, he moved on. He came back 30 minutes later, on the return leg of his round, and the conference room door was open wider now. In the light spilling into the hallway, he could see documents spread across the table. Header blocks on the lab reports, the facility address, the date fields, the certification notations in the lower right corners. He stood there a moment. His mind didn't produce a revelation, not exactly. It produced something quieter and more specific, a small, physical mismatch, the kind he'd trained himself for 15 years to catch. The way a discrepancy in a load-bearing calculation made his eye snag. Not because he was hunting for it, but because something in the document's internal logic didn't sit right. He looked at the facility name, the address, the suite number. He knew that building, not the way someone who worked there knew it, but the way an inspector did, because he'd reviewed the county permit records for its 2017 lab renovation 18 months earlier, during a routine audit of his own prior inspection notes. The suite number on the documents belonged to the primary analytical lab, and that lab he remembered with the quiet certainty of a man whose memory for paperwork was occupational, hadn't existed in that suite until the renovation was finished. The certificate of occupancy had been issued in October 2017. The lab reports on the table were dated August and September of 2017. The lab those reports claimed to come from hadn't legally existed yet when they were supposedly written. Marcus stepped into the doorway. The attorneys turned. An older man at the head of the table, Vincent Moretti, per his building ID, looked at him the way someone looks at a parking meter they didn't expect to see in a conference room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Marcus said, "but those lab reports on the table with the Langston Biosciences suite number, are those originals or copies? Can I help you with something, Mr. Webb? I work security." He nodded at the documents. That suite number references the primary analytical lab on the 3rd floor of the Langston building. "That's correct," said a younger attorney by the window, Carla Osei, the associate who always stayed latest, not with contempt, but the flat efficiency of someone explaining something to a person who hadn't been read in. "Those are the disputed documents. That lab wasn't certified for occupancy until October 2017, Marcus said. The reports are dated August and September." The room went very still. Carla Osei set down her pen. Audrey Langston, who had been sitting with her back to the door, turned in her chair. Vincent Moretti took off his glasses. "What did you say?" "The analytical lab in that suite was part of a 2017 renovation. The county occupancy certificate wasn't issued until October 17th. I reviewed those records myself, as part of a quality audit when I worked for Allegheny County Building Services." He paused. "If those reports were generated in that lab, they can't have been generated in August." "Who are you?" said an attorney at the far end of the table, trying for measured and landing closer to sharp. "Marcus Webb. I work the overnight desk." He glanced at the documents again. 15 years, structural engineer and building inspector, Allegheny County before this. Carla Osei was already pulling one of the disputed reports toward her, scanning the header. "You're telling us the origination date on this document is physically impossible, given the certification timeline of the facility it claims to be from." "I'm telling you it's worth checking tonight," Marcus said. "The permit records are public. Occupancy certificate, 900 Commerce Drive, 3rd floor lab suite. Renovation filed March 2017. Final inspection September 28th. Certificate issued October 17th. Those reports are dated August 4th and September 9th. She was on her phone before he finished the sentence. Vincent Moretti looked at Audrey. Audrey was looking at Marcus with the precise, total attention of a woman who had spent 11 weeks watching people look past the thing that mattered. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice steady in the way of something held carefully. "Are you certain? Certain enough that you should pull the records tonight? I know which database. I can write down the search string." 20 minutes later, the Allegheny County Permit database was open on Carla Osei's laptop. The certificate of occupancy for 900 Commerce Drive, Suite 340, on the screen in front of 5 attorneys and one woman who hadn't quite breathed normally in 11 weeks. Issue date, October 17, 2017. The disputed lab reports were dated August 4th and September 9th. 37 documents, purportedly generated in a laboratory that hadn't yet legally existed. Glenn Harwick, who had sworn that Audrey Langston instructed him to alter data in that lab, hadn't accounted for the fact that the lab was under active construction during the period in question. its walls unfinished, its ventilation uncertified, its equipment not yet installed. The reports hadn't been altered. They'd been fabricated entirely, then backdated to a period when the facility's records would be too sparse to cross-reference. Not by Audrey, by Glenn Harwick himself, building a paper trail that pointed the authorization at her instead of him. The motive, which the defense team spent the next 6 hours piecing together, wasn't complicated. Harwick had, in fact, been manipulating trial data, not on Audrey's instructions, but on his own, part of a years-long effort to accelerate approvals and hit his performance targets. When the FDA's post-market surveillance began quietly flagging adverse event patterns, 18 months after Vilanax launched, Harwick understood what was coming and spent 3 months building documents that would make Audrey the one who'd ordered what he had done. He'd built the fabrication carefully enough, in fact, that he hadn't thought to check building permit timelines, and so hadn't known that the lab he claimed to have used was, for a 2-month window, a construction zone with plastic sheeting where its exterior walls would eventually be. Vincent Moretti filed the motion at 4:18 that morning. By 9, the presiding judge had reviewed the occupancy certificate and building permit records and issued an emergency order demanding the prosecution address the discrepancy. By afternoon, 2 additional forensic analysts retained on an emergency basis confirmed the disputed reports showed characteristics consistent with fabrication from a single source, not authorized amendment from multiple parties. By the following day, a federal investigator who'd spent 12 hours combing Harwick's personal files found the original unaltered lab reports. The ones Audrey had actually reviewed and signed, buried in an encrypted partition of a hard drive Harwick had reported as lost. The prosecution moved to dismiss all charges against Audrey Langston on a Friday afternoon, 4 days after Marcus Webb stopped his cart outside a conference room door and said what he said. He was finishing his shift when Audrey found him at 6:15 in the morning, as the building was just beginning to fill. He was filling out his handover notes in the same methodical way he filled out everything. She wore the same kind of precise dark clothes she always did, the leather portfolio under her arm, and she looked like someone who had finally slept, after a very long time without it. Mr. Webb. Mrs. Langston. She set the portfolio on the desk between them and was quiet for a moment. Not gathering words, it seemed, so much as deciding which ones were actually sufficient. "I'm not going to say thank you," she said, "because that phrase isn't built to carry what I mean right now. It's fine." "It isn't," she said without softness, which he thought was the more honest version of the same sentiment. 18 attorneys spent 6 weeks looking at those documents and didn't see what you saw in 4 minutes. They were looking for legal problems in the documents. I was looking at the documents as documents. There's a difference. Usually. The morning light came through the lobby glass at a low angle, catching the terrazzo floor and throwing its pattern upward, making the whole entrance look briefly ancient. "My team tells me you left building inspection because of your daughter." He hadn't told the legal team that. He was mildly unsurprised she'd found out anyway. "My wife died in 2020, he said. Rosie was 7. I needed hours that made sense for an 8-year-old. Rosie. She's 11 now, plays cello, is intensely serious about it, and has very strong opinions about breakfast foods." He said it plainly, the way he said most things. "She's good." Audrey watched him with the full attention she gave the things that interested her. Not warm, exactly, but complete. He'd noticed it the first time she'd come in for a strategy session. "What would it take," she said, "to bring someone with your background into Langston? Not legal, not compliance necessarily. I have a facilities team, a construction program. We're breaking ground on a new research campus in Delaware this fall." A pause. "What I apparently don't have is anyone who reads permit records the way you do." He looked at his handover notes, at the terrazzo floor. He thought about the overnight desk, the predictable hours, the 4 blocks between this building and Rosie's school. I don't know if I'm what you're looking for. You're exactly what I'm looking for. I just described the job. The hours, he said. Name them. My daughter gets out of school at 3:15. I need to be reachable by 3, able to leave by 2:45. School holidays. Her winter concert, second Thursday of December every year. Done. You didn't ask what I'd need to be paid. I know what a building inspector with 15 years in Allegheny County earns, she said. I'll offer you something better than that, and we'll see if the number is right. He thought about the overnight desk, the empty lobby at 2 in the morning, the terrazzo floor lit at 6:15. He thought about Rosie, 11, serious about the cello, strong-minded about breakfast, the reason he'd taken this job in the first place, and the reason he could leave it now. I'll need to talk to Rosie, he said. She has veto power. Something in Audrey's face moved, not quite a smile but close to its territory. I'd expect nothing less. He brought the offer sheet home that evening and set it on the kitchen table. Rosie, doing homework across from him with the focused frown she wore over a difficult passage, looked up. What's that? Job offer. She read the letterhead. Langston Biosciences. She'd seen the name on the news. 11 and perceptive, she hadn't asked directly what happened at work the night of the 19th, but she'd been watching him the careful way she watched him when she was working something out without being ready to ask. Is this the lady you helped? Yes. Is it a good job? It would be a better job. She looked at the numbers. He hadn't hidden them. She was 11, not 6, and he'd raised her to look at things directly. Dad, this is a lot. I know. Are you going to still pick me up? That was the first condition I gave her, before anything else. She studied him with the assessing gaze she'd been developing since she was about 4, the one she used whenever she'd decided an adult needed evaluating. She agreed to that first, before money? Before money. Rosie considered this with the gravity it deserved. Okay. Yeah, okay. She went back to her homework, then looked up once more. Did you tell her about my concert? December, second Thursday. Already on the calendar. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to the difficult passage. Marcus sat down across from her, poured himself a cup of coffee, and watched her work. The same focused attention she brought to the cello, to school, to the careful business of being 11 in a world that had lost one of its 2 fixed points 4 years ago and had been adjusting ever since. He thought about the conference room, the documents spread across the glass table, the held breath quality of the silence after he'd spoken. Not dismissal, not yet, but the particular stillness of people hearing something that didn't fit and hadn't yet decided whether the something was wrong, or whether everything they'd assumed was. He thought about Glenn Harwick, who had built his lie carefully and missed the one thing that couldn't be falsified. The plain, factual record of when a room had been built. The kind of thing no one looks for. Because it doesn't live in any legal document. It lives in county permit records, in the dry language of occupancy certificates, in the patient accumulation of dates and signatures that make up the paper skeleton of every building that has ever stood. He had spent 15 years reading that language. He hadn't stopped reading it. He'd simply stopped getting paid to. He thought about Elena, the way she used to sit at this same table, turned slightly, elbow on the back of her chair, listening to something she found genuinely interesting, which was most things. That had been one of her better qualities, one among a private list he'd never needed to write down, that he still ran through some mornings when the overnight shift was quiet, and there was nothing to do but sit with his own mind. She would have asked the right question, he thought. Was it about the documents, or about not being able to walk away from something that wasn't right? Both, he would have said, as usual. Rosie got up, packed her homework away, and got herself a glass of water, with the automatic confidence of someone who'd been managing this kitchen for a long time. "Dad, you're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thinking about Mom thing." He looked at her. That clear, precise assessment that always caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was so accurate. "Yeah," he said, "a little." She came around the table and leaned against his arm, not dramatically, just in the simple, weight-bearing way of someone who knows presence is sometimes the whole point. She smelled like the shampoo with the green label she'd picked out herself. He put his arm around her and looked at the offer sheet and thought about October in Philadelphia, a new research campus in Delaware, and permit records that told the truth about the order in which things had been built. 3 weeks later, Audrey called on a Wednesday afternoon, not about work, or not only. He'd started the new role the previous Monday and was reviewing the Delaware site's preliminary construction documents when the call came through. "There's something I want to ask you," she said, without preamble. She was always without preamble. "And you can say no. I'm hosting a small dinner for the people who made the difference this past year. Not a gala, not a reception, 12 people, the kind of thing where you can actually talk. I'd like you to come." He thought of Rosie. When? March 28th, a Saturday. Rosie had cello Saturday mornings, and Saturday evenings had become, for reasons neither of them had examined, a fixed ritual, a movie she picked, a dinner she chose. "My daughter," he said. "She's invited, obviously." He hadn't expected that. It's a strange crowd for an 11-year-old. She sounds like she can handle a strange crowd. He asked Rosie that night. She considered it with appropriate seriousness. About 90 seconds, eyes on the ceiling the way she looked at a hard cello passage. "Will there be good food?" "Presumably." "Will I have to wear something uncomfortable?" "I'll leave that to your judgment." She looked at the ceiling a moment longer. "I'll go. But if it's boring, I'm allowed to say so." "Fair." He told Audrey the next morning. "Tell her the dress code is intentionally informal," she said, "and if it's boring, she can tell me directly." He relayed this. Rosie, upon hearing it, revised her opinion of Audrey Langston upward by several meaningful degrees. The dinner fell on a night when the evening air still carried the last thin edge of winter. Marcus arrived out of uniform. Rosie arrived in the blue dress she'd chosen herself, worn with the self-possession of someone at peace with a considered decision. Audrey met them at the door. Not a staff member, not an assistant. Audrey herself, in something dark and simple, and shook Rosie's hand the way she shook everyone's, as if it were a document she intended to read correctly. "You must be Rosie. You must be Ms. Langston." A fraction of a pause, and then Audrey looked at her with that same full attention look. "Your father tells me you're serious about the cello." "Very." "Tell me about the piece you're working on." Rosie didn't need much more invitation than that. Standing in the doorway, completely unself-conscious, she launched into the detailed, technically specific case for a fingering problem in the second movement of a Bach suite, and Marcus stood slightly to the side and listened to his daughter explain it to one of the most powerful executives in the pharmaceutical industry, who was listening back with the concentrated attention of someone genuinely trying to understand. He had spent a long time believing that the shape of his life, the overnight desk, the 4-block walk, the fixed and predictable rhythm of it, was exactly the structure Rosie needed, that the thing he offered her was stability, which was not nothing. In the years after Elena, it had been closer to everything than most things. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that stability might one day be large enough to hold more than that the structure he'd built so carefully to protect her could be added to without being dismantled. That a life made quiet enough for grief could, eventually, be made a little less quiet, not instead of what he'd built, but alongside it. Rosie was still talking. Audrey was still listening. The evening light came through the windows at a low angle, and beyond the doorway the room was full of people and food and the warm noise of a dinner not yet begun. Somewhere in the middle of it, Marcus Webb stood with his hands in his pockets and understood that this was the kind of moment you couldn't plan for. Only be ready to recognize, after years of paying attention. He had spent 15 years reading documents, and he'd learned long ago that the most important information wasn't always where you expected to find it, and that the people most likely to miss it were the ones who already thought they knew where to look. He hadn't stopped looking. He was still learning where. Rosie glanced back at him mid-sentence, a flicker of an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but carried everything a smile would have and more. And Marcus looked back at his daughter with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who has always known that the most load-bearing thing in any structure is never what you can measure on paper. It is what has been quietly holding everything up all along.